Good evening. This was Michael Cohen-Weissert, a wonderful, as you can hear, a wonderfully talented young musician who gave you a bit of a taster of some of his own compositions and improvisations, based also on Arabic and Jewish traditional music, and based on, as I learned in our last conversation, on his great admiration for Keith Jarrett. And you probably hear some Keith Jarrettish motifs in his playing as well. So another round of applause, please, for Michael Cohen. You'll get to hear another taste at the end of the lecture, so please stay until the end of this evening. My name is Asher Biemann. I teach at the University of Virginia in the United States, and together with my dear colleague Ufuk Topkara, I am the co-organizer of a 3-day workshop on a forum on Jewish Muslim thought and theology on the theme of cultures of continuity. As you can imagine, a workshop like this is an enormous effort. It requires planning, it requires vision. And I'd like to begin with a personal thanks to Ufuk for making this workshop possible. Ufuk and I met first at the University of Virginia many years ago and struck up a friendship and an intellectual congeniality. And Ufuk really has been a remarkable host, a generous host, was more than spoiled us in every possible way. He didn't tell us that we should not eat a week before, so we were working hard, actually, to master the culinary gifts that Ufuk had organized for us, but also was able to create, and I think something of this will transpire also tonight, was able to create an atmosphere that is incredibly welcoming, that is open, that is stimulating. And the Humboldt University is very lucky to have Ufuk, I should say. And Virginia, I'm very sad not to have Ufuk. But I'm also very fortunate to be collaborating with Ufuk across the Atlantic. So if you don't mind joining me in another big round of applause for Ufuk. Of course, you didn't notice the work and effort that Ufuk's wonderful assistants, Maeve McGrath and Esma Unset, did behind the scenes. So much behind the scenes and so perfectly coordinated that actually you really didn't notice it. So thank you to Maeve and Esma for all your efforts, for your work, and for your devotion, really, to this project. I'm thanking in absentia my colleagues at the University of Virginia, especially James Loeffler, the director of the Jewish Studies program, and also our own administrative assistant, Shelley Penton, who was instrumental in designing these programs and the posters that you've seen. And of course, we are extremely grateful for the generous support from the Humboldt University zu Berlin, the Berliner Institut für Islamische Theologie, the Virginia Center for the Study of Religion, and the Jewish Studies program at Virginia. And finally, a thank you to all of those who joined the workshop as participants. In some ways, Ufuk and I, we dreamt up the idea and we organized it together. We were more or less the contractors of this, but you are the real builders. You gave it life, and your conversations really filled this workshop with content. So a big, big thank you to all of our participants. And now, I've not forgotten about you, Ephraim. Now we come to our special guest. We're extremely fortunate to have with us one of the great scholars of Jewish philosophy in our generation, one of the most prominent figures in interreligious dialogue and thought. Ephraim Meir is Professor Emeritus of Modern Jewish Philosophy at Bar-Ilan University in Ramat Gan, Israel. He's one of the leading experts on dialogical philosophy who has written extensively on figures such as Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, Emmanuel Levinas, none of them, I should add, known to be particularly easy philosophers to read. It takes about a lifetime to study them, and Ephraim has spent a lifetime making the work accessible, comprehensible, and most of all, timely to a wider readership. And all of you who have met Ephraim already during this conference realize that he's not only a scholar of dialogue, but he's also a man of dialogue. If dialogue has a face, then it's really Ephraim. He lives what he teaches. And this is one of the many reasons why we asked him tonight to come and conclude our workshop. Born in Belgium, Ephraim earned a doctorate in theology from Louvain University in 1979, before immigrating to Israel in 1983 and joining the faculty at Bar-Ilan in 1989. In addition to his appointment at Bar-Ilan, he has held guest professorships at the Marc Bloch University in Strasbourg, the Faculty of Evangelische Theologie at the University of Hamburg, the Hochschule für Jüdische Studien in Heidelberg, and the University of Arizona in Phoenix. From 2009 to 2017, Ephraim was also the Levinas guest professor for Jewish dialogue studies and interreligious theology at the Academy of World Religions at the University of Hamburg. And he held fellowships at the Center of Theological Inquiry in Princeton and the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study in South Africa. And to many of us in the field, he's known also as the marvelous and exuberant president of the International Franz Rosenzweig Society. By my count, Ephraim has published 18 books. And because 18, as you've heard this morning in our workshop, is a lucky number in Judaism, I expect that next time I count, he will have written 36. Ephraim writes and speaks and thinks in many languages. And his books and essays have appeared in English, in Hebrew, German, French, and Dutch. Among his recent works are Levinas's Jewish Thought Between Jerusalem and Athens, Identity Dialogically Constructed, Difference and Dialogue Between Heschel and Buber, Dialogical Thought and Identity, Interreligious Theology, Its Value and Moorings in Modern Jewish Philosophy, Becoming Interreligious, Old New Jewish Humanism, and Faith in the Plural. His latest monograph is entitled The Marvel of Interrelatedness, which appeared in 2021. And it constitutes in many ways the capstone of his dialogical thinking. Dialogue, the book begins, is about establishing ties and making others special. And later in the book he writes, dialogue, as the interrelatedness of all with all, brings a healthy correction to an exaggerated individualism and to social indifference. It transforms the isolated I into a communicating and hospitable being, celebrates plurality, and makes meaningful speech between people possible. The ability of dialogue to elevate the other and transform the self is the fundamental premise of a dense exploration of religious encounter and religious plurality. But the book also offers a dialogical reimagination of ethics and politics, ideas of learning, translation, humanism, and Jewish eco-theology. At core lies Ephraim's concept of transdifference, which he describes as an open identity that has otherness in itself, and which expands the dialogical category of the between, Buber's Zwischen, into an active acknowledgement and simultaneous transcendence or translation of religious difference. In fact, translation for Ephraim Meir implies openness, crossing borders, and bridging. It is, as he writes, itself an act of peace. Among Ephraim's earlier works are Towards an Active Memory, Society, Man and God After Auschwitz, Letters of Love, Franz Rosenzweig's spiritual biography, and the Over in Light of the Gritti Letters, Jewish existential philosophers in dialogue, and Modernes jüdisches Denken. I believe there is no better way to conclude our workshop than with Ephraim's lifelong work on dialogical philosophy and human interrelatedness. Some of you recall that in my opening reflections in his workshop, I quoted, as I must within these walls, from Humboldt's Task of the Historian, where Humboldt writes, "Where two beings are separated by a gaping abyss, there can be no bridge of understanding." The rejoinder to these words comes from Ephraim himself, as he writes, "Separation, walls, and distances lead to forgetfulness of our interconnection to the world." And so, as we listen tonight to our speaker, we must remember that not far from here, a senseless war is tearing through human lives, and that not long ago, a wall divided this very city, and that walls, whether physical or psychological, continue to be built in places near and far. We're honored tonight to have Ephraim here with us, to remind us of our interconnectedness and to help us think through the futures of dialogue.
Thank you so much, dear Asher, for your kind words. I really appreciate. I would like to start with thanking also Asher and Ufuk for having invited me to this inaugural conference of the Forum of Jewish Muslim Thought and Theology. The Forum wants an innovation of traditions and promotes the cooperation between the traditions. So it's my hope that with this conference and hopefully with other conferences of the Forum, we receive a new horizon. It's ufuk, isn't it? A new horizon, ufuk, ofik. And that with this new horizon, we can also receive a cooperation between us and I would say a happiness, which in Hebrew is osher. Thank you, Asher. Let me start, ladies and gentlemen, with a problematization of the word identity. We are all embedded in concrete situations. We act and think out of specific traditions. Yet, the word identity has become very problematic. Identities quickly become fixed and rigid. They are frequently formed on the negative background of others. A parochial, narrow and constrictive we is contrasted with the outgroup called they. In addition, and parallel to the word identity, the word belonging easily becomes problematic. In our more and more culturally diverse societies, there are multiple forms of belonging. We belong to our own group in a more or less degree, and we also belong to the world in which different groups exist. Belonging always denotes belonging to a particular group, but also to the world as such. Too much emphasis on particularity leads to parochialism. Too much accent on a cosmopolitical belonging to all neglects one's always concrete embodiment in specific cultures and groups. So the word identity and the word belonging are ambiguous words. Moreover, in our times, we witness the ascendance of political leaders who promise to care for the interest of their own group at the expense of other groups. They lead a troublesome identity politics that promote the own by excluding the other. Discrimination, humiliation, non-recognition, and indifference, and even hatred are the result of such a disastrous politics. This dreadful situation is well known, unfortunately, in many countries of our world. Identity politics is gaining field all over the globe. Happily, we also witness countercultures that swim against the tide by advancing a dialogical identity. A few examples will suffice. The Kenyan philosopher John Mbiti pointed to the relational I with the sentence, "I am because we are." This is part of the African Ubuntu culture. Buddhist culture hails the interconnectedness by deconstructing identity through the An-Atma, the non-self. The Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who passed away recently, conceives being as inter-being. For the Jewish dialogical philosopher Martin Buber, the I becomes I through a you. Playing upon the initial phrase of the Hebrew Bible, Buber writes, "In the beginning was relation." For the French Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, the I is summoned by the other. In the answer to the other's call, the I becomes l'un pour l'autre. The list of dialogical thinkers in various cultures could be easily expanded. If we listen carefully to the narrative of the other in an agendaless presence, we could learn how she lives and thinks. We could celebrate the plurality of worldviews and contribute to the shaping of dialogical persons and dialogical societies. Casting aside suspicion and prejudices, we open ourselves to the interconnectedness of all. This opens the ufuk, the horizon, the new we. Dialogue creates a shared and a common world, a world of the end. It is more about attitudes than about contents, more about deeds than about words, more focused on the doable than upon the knowable. In dialogue as in-betweenness, one transcends one's own self in orientation to the other, and this in turn allows us to discover the alterity in ourselves. We do not live in parallel worlds, one alongside the other. Neither are we merely a part of a whole. Dialogue strives to create at the same time unity, but not without dissolving the singularity. So particularity and bridging and unity belong together. The creation of a relational I, more broadly of a dialogical society, contests a static identity and surprises a closed identity with alterity. The lofty reality of dialogue creates an in-between space with interaction between people and concrete involvement with others. In dialogue, one makes the other present. It is not only about allowing others to be different, but to recognize them in their otherness that cannot be absorbed in sameness. At the same time, one does not leave the other in his or her otherness. One engages in communicating and shaping a common world. In dialogue, one celebrates plurality and promotes the other who becomes visible. Looking positively at religious others and at their specific contribution to human culture influences their reality and future. In what is known as the Pygmalion effect, expectations affect the behavior of others. It is in this perspective that interreligious dialogue receives its relevance and vitality. To my mind, interreligious dialogue has foremost an eminent ethical dimension. The religious other asks to be respected and listened to. She demands that one approaches her story in a non-judgmental way and without preconceived ideas. It is not an easy thing. Religious exclusivists are more concentrated with the survival, the corroboration, and expansion of their own group than with communicating with religious others. In their radical dissimulation, they feel superior, belittle, and blatantly discriminate others. In their splendid isolation, the exclusivists forget the alterity. On the other hand, on the other edge of the spectrum, cosmopolitical people may forget their own specificity. In a radical assimilation, their particularity gets lost in an all-absorbing unity. The task is, therefore, to go beyond radical assimilation and radical dissimulation in what I call, and Asher kindly reminded that, transdifference. In transdifference, one respects the differences and at the same time shares a common world. In transdifference, one communicates not despite the difference, but thanks to the differences. People belong to different worlds, but they also belong to the larger world. That's my main argument. Since we live in one world, and not in parallel worlds, communication is a lofty human possibility. Shaping one's identity takes place in the own group as well as in relation with other groups. Interrelatedness goes against identity politics and works with mutual acceptance and promotion. In this perspective, interreligious dialogue has the potential of healing religious rivalry and clashing cultures. In interreligious dialogue, one receives the gift of the other's otherness and becomes different to oneself. The aim of interreligious dialogue is therefore to create bonds with religious others. One does not have to be an academic specialist of religion or a formal representative of an institutional religion in order to engage in interreligious dialogue. Each of us is a unique human being who belongs to a particular religious narrative with our own life, with its own life experience and position. However, we are also in contact with religious and non-religious others. John Donne's utterance, "No man is an island," was made concrete by Abraham Joshua Heschel, who claimed that no religion is an island. The quality of our God talk depends on the way this contributes to respect for human rights and for the dignity of every human being. Beyond an academic elitist theology, ordinary people have their own God talk. In this way, theology is democratized, brought out of the academic ivory tower, and linked to the concrete problems of the world. In a theology that has human rights at its center, the transcendent is approachable in the realization of justice and equality and in loving relationships. People belonging to different religions may become engaged in the implementation of cross-bordering values, human values. 4 years ago, I described Judaism in my book, Old New Jewish Humanism, as a specific kind of humanism. A few questions. Can we come to an ethical interpretation of Judaism and Islam, of halakha and sharia? The medieval scholar Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah writes the following beautiful sentence, and I quote him: Sharia is all about wisdom and achieving people's welfare in this life and the afterlife. It is all about justice, mercy, wisdom, and good. Thus, any ruling that replaces justice with injustice, mercy with its opposite, common good with mischief, or wisdom with nonsense, is a ruling that does not belong to the Sharia, even if it's claimed to be so according to some interpretation. End of quotation. Taqwa, traditionally conceived as Muslim piety, manifested in food restrictions, prayer, and almsgiving, may be reimagined as God awareness, potentially present in every human being. Such a God awareness is immediately linked to the cultivation of attention to and compassion for other human beings. For Muhammad Khurshid, not rituals, but rather the ability to participate in the other's joy and suffering, to care and to forgive, constitutes service of God. Rituals with their spiritual dimension are a means to become more loving and merciful. They are important in as far as they stimulate a human being to accomplish her fitra, her ontological condition orientation to a loving and merciful God, and her participation in God's life. The peaceful development of the human being and her loving relationship to others should be at the heart of every religion. Rediscovering the humanistic core in Judaism and in Islam allows for criticism on the way our religions function in society, and it shows us the relevance of our religions in the contemporary world. Religious inwardness should be expressed in the reverence of the other human being, in the continuous battle against human suffering and humiliation, in marching together for the cause of the disadvantaged, and in support of civil rights. An innovative approach to our religions could, of course, focus on classical foundational texts and look for positive utterances about religious others in a humanistic dialogical hermeneutics. Yet, just as is the case with the words identity and belonging, religious texts are frequently ambiguous. They further function in specific historical and geographical contexts which have radically changed in the course of time. What is decisive is not the number of positive utterances in biblical verses or in surahs of the Quran. Decisive is rather how past religious utterances function in present-day cultural, economic, social, and political contexts. Texts are important. The relation to text in midrashim, drashot, tafsir are even more important. Holy scriptures are for the development of human beings. Khurshid, whom I quoted already, has contributed to spelling out a humanistic Quran hermeneutics. The underlying image of God is not a furious, punishing God with instructions for humans, but a God who loves and is merciful as a mother for her child, and who wants the development and liberation of the human being. The Quran is not about master-slave, but about a loving relationship between man and God. Poetically, Khurshid writes, the Quran is a love letter, a Liebesbrief. Similar to Khurshid, I see the Torah as a letter of love which the beloved reads again and again in order to become worthy of the love of her lover. The more she reads this letter as an expression of love, the more she wants to become worthy of his love. The more she reads this letter as an expression of love, the more she becomes religiously mature. Torah, as the Quran, is therefore for us, for the human beings. This implies a dialogical hermeneutics in which responsibility and human dignity are central. A theology of human rights should not merely focus upon text. It should discuss lived religiosity and its relevance for society. Othering the others has led to estrangement. Deep listening to their narrative leads to diminishing hatred and conflict, preparing the way for a more peaceful coexistence. What is at stake is shaping a dialogical identity that cannot be conceived without a relation to others and without a common concern for the future or the creation of a new we. Can we become partners who care for democracy, freedom, equality, and other human rights, with and beyond our religious affiliations? In interreligious dialogue, one trusts the religious other in order to develop a new consciousness of the interdependence of all religions in view of a more peaceful society. The underlying idea is that if religions are not for the world, they remain perhaps high and magnificent trees, but without fruit. Religions are not there for themselves. They are for the human beings, not vice versa. They have a soteriological function in a genuine, transformational, and trustful dialogue, emphasis upon the moral quality present in various responses to the inconceivable reality. As I argued, interreligious dialogue is an imminent ethical reality. In interreligious dialogue, as in any dialogue, the primordial aim is not to know the other, situating the other, understanding her in her historical, social, economic, and cultural context does not come first. It is important, but it's not the first thing. Meeting the other requires foremost an ethical mindset. Knowing, comparing, experiencing, and situating are secondary. Moreover, ethical orthopraxis is more important than correct orthodoxy. To be righteous is more important than having the right face. In acknowledging the religious other, one testifies to the divine. With all our specificities and differences, we are not condemned to live in separated and unconnected worlds and to see others negatively. A real interreligious dialogue offers an alternative. Now I come to the dialogical theology. So I started with dialogue, went to the religious dialogue, now interreligious theology based upon the interreligious dialogue. Dialogical or interreligious theology is a theology that has dialogue as its goal and method. It also conducts a dialogue with the secular world and its values. It is based upon dialogue and reflects upon it. Dialogue implies respect for differences and going beyond this in communication. It maintains separatedness and develops one's relational capacities. The ethical call of the other implies an ethical or dialogical hermeneutics of our religious sources. In a dialogical theology, as in religious and non-religious dialogues, transdifference is crucial. Transdifference avoids the absolutization of differences, as in postmodernity, as well as the absolutization of sameness, as in modernity. It avoids the pitfall of an otherness that is not approachable, and of a sameness that annexes and functionalizes the other. So interreligious theology is about the self and the other, about boundaries and crossing boundaries, about celebrating one's specificity and becoming inspired by others. Boundaries mark different spiritual homes. At the same time, these boundaries are somehow relative. Living one's home does not exclude involvement with others in the broader world. Jews may invite Muslims in their home. Muslims may visit the homes of Jews. Jews and Muslims may live together in one country, one town, one street, and one home. Exchange and cooperation replace isolated entities and create a coexistence in a pluralist society. Most importantly, in a transdifferent religious dialogue, one's uniqueness lies in the ethical link to the other. As John Donne has pointedly described, one may pass over to another way of life, to another religion, and come back with new insights in one's own religion. Interreligious encounters require great imagination. They presuppose a religious conviviality that challenges the usual rift between religious groups. In an interreligious theology based upon interreligious meetings and dialogues, one's own religion is only one collective experience in the mosaic of religious experience that all testify to the transcendent. Interreligious theology, as a theology of dialogue with dialogical means, contains a sustained reflection on a multiplicity of approaches to the transcendent. In such a theology, one learns from religious others. One is also critical of others, but most of all, of oneself, in a healthy self-criticism. Now, this conference, as during these 3 marvelous days, was about continuity, culture of continuity, continuation, discontinuity, recontinuity, and I have some words about that. I deem that the success of interreligious dialogue depends upon the preservation of traditions, as well as their renovation and transformation. Traditions are different reactions to the divine, and as such, they are a mixture of human and divine elements. One tends to think that traditions are fixed, an archaic body of behaviors and opinions. The truth is that they are constantly evolving. They are not a mere repetition of the past, but a challenge for the present and the future. Traditions may become violent and oppressive power structures. In an innovative approach to traditions proposed by the present Forum of Jewish Muslim Theology and Thought, one becomes conscious of problematic passages in religious sources and develops positive attitudes towards religious others. An interreligious theology reflects on interreligious dialogue as a meeting place and offers a critical reflection on religious traditions. It works with concepts from different traditions to reimagine them in a post-traditional epoch. Not a retraditionalization, but a reinvention of tradition will make religions relevant again for today's society. The Forum for Jewish Muslim Theology and Thought actively seeks to engage in creating new narratives and discourses, emphasizing simultaneously a continuation of the religious intellectual heritage. More particularly, the Forum seeks to develop contemporary Islamic theology and thought as an important emerging field of research. The Forum focuses upon the question how Islamic theology and thought could be brought into systematic engagement with modern discourses. It is believed that Jewish thought offers perhaps possibilities to advance Islamic thought. To my view, both Jews and Muslims have a thought that may flourish and blossom in discussion with modern and contemporary discourses. Both are challenged to rediscover uniting and humanizing forces. The Jewish-Muslim dialogue could sharpen self-criticism and lead to reviewing and reshaping identities. Interaction with the other leads to the discovery of alterity in ourselves. In the interreligious meeting, the differences are appreciated, but we are also called to be interconnected. No religion is autarkic. All religions are part of the greater human community. Dialogical or pluralized theology leaves polemics behind and turns to the religious other. Dialogical turn in philosophy and in theology, which we witness today, brings about a new kind of religiosity in which openness to the other and interrelatedness are central. 4 years ago, I will tell you a meeting, I had a great meeting with a Muslim scholar. I met in Princeton Martin Nguyen. Some of you heard about it, of course. He is the son of Vietnamese refugees, and he is a professor of religious study in Fairfield University, Connecticut. Nguyen just published his book, Modern Muslim Theology, in which he develops a narrative theology of the Muslim tradition. He creatively shows how tradition is continually developing. He brings a parallel between Al-Kaaba and tradition. Al-Kaaba functions as an allegory for tradition, just as Al-Kaaba is a sacred source and reflects at the same time a human history. Tradition is both of God and humanity. Al-Kaaba is the axis mundi, and it orients towards God. Yet, Al-Kaaba can be made into its opposite, set on fire and witness bloodshed. Nguyen deems that just as Al-Kaaba changes, the tradition depends upon all the generations. The black stone can be taken away and be returned. God's house must be made whole again. I deem that Nguyen's thoughts on the Muslim tradition can be applied to other religious traditions, which are all a mixture of divine and human elements. As expressions of human culture, traditions have a Janus phase. They may contribute to dialogue and interconnectedness. They also may be exclusivist, inhuman, and violent. They may lead away from God in violent negation of others. They also may be near to God in nearness to others. The restoration of the sacred space between the human beings, their interdependence and positive interaction testify to the divine presence. To bring this about, one must admit that traditions are not an aim in themselves. They are necessary, but cannot be absolutized. They are the way of human beings to connect with the transcendent. Various traditions connect with the divine, but they are not the divine source itself. They are a response to it. The goal of traditions is therefore to bring about a dialogue between the divine and the human, which is realized in interhuman connectivity. Traditions should respect the divine space, that is the place where people interact in a dialogical way. The ethical quality of religions depends upon their contribution to the world, which is characterized by plurality. Each specific tradition is a possible enrichment for religious others. Instead of an excessive sympathy for the own people and an antipathy towards the other religious groups, we will have to preserve, restructure, reinvent, reimagine our traditions in order to make them relevant in the world of today. Now, I already said that interreligious dialogue is a very difficult thing, certainly in situations of conflicts which are there in the entire world. And I will talk a little bit about fanaticism. The famous sociologist of religion, Peter Berger, also passed away recently, was acutely aware of the fanatic elements within religions. In a review of my book, Interreligious Theology, Peter Berger mildly and humorously criticizes my work in pointing to the duty to say no to certain religious manifestations. And I quote what he is writing in his review. I don't think I would want to enter into dialogue with whatever degenerate imams legitimate the hell on earth being instituted by ISIS in the areas it controls in Iraq and Syria. Or suppose there still survived the cult of human sacrifice which existed in Mesoamerica in pre-Columbian times. Imagine, say, that the delegation of the Aztec theologians were welcomed in an inter-religious conference at the World Council of Churches in Geneva. Thank you very much for coming to this conference. We are greatly looking forward to hearing your paper explaining why the gods have to be fed by the blood of sacrificial victims. End of quotation. He is a very humorous human being. I agree with Peter Berger that there are limits to the interreligious dialogue. Several attitudes make dialogue, unfortunately, impossible. One of them is a violent reading of sacred scriptures and the lack of their contextualization. Another impediment lies in exclusivist, absolute truth claims in the approach to religious others. 20 years ago, the famous writer, Israeli writer Amos Oz, talked here in Germany about fanaticism that, I quote him, lies in uncompromising righteousness. For him, again I quote, conformity and uniformity, the urge to belong and the desire to make everyone else belong, end of quotation, is the most widely spread form of fanaticism. It is worth to quote a somewhat longer passage of Amos Oz's speech entitled How to Cure a Fanatic. And I bring a little bit larger quotation now from Amos Oz. "No man is an island," said John Donne. "But I humbly dare to add to this, no man and no woman is an island. But every one of us is a peninsula, half attached to the mainland, half facing the ocean, half connected to family and friends, and culture and tradition and country and nation and sex and language and many other types. And the other half wants to be left alone to face the ocean. I think," Amos Oz said, "we ought to be allowed to remain peninsulas. Every social and political system which turns each of us into a Darwinian island and the rest of humanity into an enemy or a rival is a monster. But at the same time, every social and political and ideological system which wants to turn each of us into no more than a molecule of the mainland is also a monstrosity. The condition of a peninsula is the proper human condition, and that's what we are, and that's what we deserve to remain. So in a sense, in every house, in every family, in every human connection, in every human connection, we actually have a relationship between a number of peninsulas, and we better remember this before we try to shape each other and turn each other around and make the next person turn our way while he or she actually needs to face the ocean for a while. And this is true of social groups and of cultures and of civilizations and of nations, and yes, of Israelis and Palestinians. No one of them is an island, and not one of them can completely mingle with the other. I know it is an unusual message in these days of violence and anger and revenge and fundamentalism and fanaticism and racism, all of which are laws in the Middle East and elsewhere. A sense of humor, the ability to imagine the other, the capacity to recognize the peninsular quality of every one of us may be at least a partial defense against the fanatic gene which we all contain. End of quotation. The words of Amos Oz on peninsulas attached to the mainland and facing the ocean, as well as his attention to the unabsorbable particular and the universal, echoes my notion of transdifference. Now, I think that there are some competencies to develop for an interreligious dialogue, and I will finish with that. I would like to point to the importance of the development of a few qualities which we could acquire in order to engage in successful interreligious dialogues. The first competency to practice is to be present. Martin Buber says, gegenwärtig, the Gegenwärtigkeit. To be present to the religious other, without preconceived ideas. Pure presence diminishes one's bias towards the other and invites her to be fully present and ready to communicate. It comes before any knowledge and experience. Presence comes before content. The context of intersubjective meeting and not the objective content of the partners in dialogue is primordial. Recognition precedes cognition. To be present before others may result in extending hospitality to others or becoming a guest in the other's home. In hospitality, the fear for the other is replaced by welcoming her in her concrete embodied existence. A second competency to develop or to acquire is the readiness, the eagerness to learn. Being in contact with the religious others could enrich us and open up unexpected horizons. And as Ufuk already really at the start of the conference reminded us, we have also this cognitive humility as a characteristic of a successful dialogical, interreligious dialogue. Humility is a third component in a successful interreligious encounter. Confronted with religious others, one may become conscious that one's own viewpoint is only one viewpoint in the colorful mosaic of approaches to the ultimate reality. To think that one has the best religion, or to shape one's own religious identity on the negative background of other religions, is a kind of religio-disi that has to be unlearned. The divine is approached from different viewpoints, which have all their own legitimacy. This necessarily entails the adoption of a multi-perspectivism. One's own religion is only one way in the mosaic of ways to transcendent reality. I often think with the image of the multicolored garment of Yosef, our brother. So, each color is important, but they are important because of the entire range of the colors, which in turn presupposes also the specificity of each and every color. Religions are different ways in approaching the unobtainable and indescribable transcendence. Humility in religious matters implies that we recognize and value religious others. Religions are, in Zen Buddhism, in Zen Buddhist parlance, only the fingers that point to the moon, not the moon itself, the fingers. Or in Muslim parlance, God is greater, Allahu Akbar. A fourth characteristic of a fruitful interreligious dialogue, closely related to the preceding one, lies in the abandonment of absolute truth claims. In dialogue, one recognizes and appreciates that religious others have their own way to the ultimate reality. This implies that one gives up superiority claims. In a positive approach to religious others, one values their specific religious worldviews along with their peculiar representations and images of the divine. The dialogical turn in religious study and practice is incompatible with absolute truth claims. Respecting the religious other is not enough. What is needed is a positive evaluation of religious plurality. Nobody has a monopoly on holiness or salvation. Is election preserved for Jews? Or are all elected? Are only Muslims enjoying a heavenly paradise? Is the sense of wonder not present in different religious traditions? In the light of a qualitative interreligious dialogue, there is no superior or only true path to salvation. Many distinctive ways lead to salvation. All are asked to develop compassion and love and to promote life in all its forms. Religions participate in the divine truth, which they cannot ultimately reach. In what is called a negative theology, it is denied that one can possess knowledge about God's essence. Such a theology is to be found, for instance, in Rambam's Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. People who pretend to completely know God are fanatics. The apophatic tradition avoids any identity between human knowledge and divine truth. The infinite is not reducible to the finite. The ultimate is inconceivable, beyond our perceptions of it. In this sense, idolatry can be redefined as the confusion between religions and God. God is the truth. Mahatma Gandhi even said the truth is God. But God is the truth. We participate in it through our relative truths. Significantly, in Psalm 85, verse 12, we read, Emet mi eretz titzmach, truth sprouts from the earth. Truth does not come from heaven. It sprouts from the earth. Bereshit Rabbah 8:1 tells us that when God decided to create a human, there was a dispute among the angels in heaven. The angel of loving kindness was in favor. The human being was charitable. The angel of truth was against. The human was full of falsehood. The angel of righteousness agreed that the human would be created. But the angel of peace objected. What did the Almighty God do? He took the truth and threw it to the earth. As it said, Emet mi eretz titzmach. The truth will sprout from the earth. I infer from this midrash that human beings seek the truth, which will sprout from the earth, meaning in an ongoing dialogue with other human beings. This makes our own truth relative. It is not a heavenly truth. Truth grows between the people in an interconnection that brings peace. Absolute truth claims hurt a peaceful relationship to other relationships, to other relations. Truth is born in dialogue, not just in tolerating the other, but in entering into dialogue with them. One does the truth in search for a meaningful life and for cross-bordering common values. A widespread opinion maintains that truth is more elevated than peace. One is ready to give up peace for the sake of truth. Many think that truth comes first and that peace has to retreat. However, the Jewish tradition supports a different opinion. In Zechariah's prophetical vision, Zechariah 8, verse 16 and 8 and 19, truth and peace belong together. And in Psalm 85, verse 11, loving kindness and truth meet. Chesed ve'emet nifgashim. The aim of truth is therefore to bring peace. And peace conditions the search for truth. Interreligious dialogue presupposes that one is not in the sole possession of truth, and that one's own religion is never superior to another. Finally, this is the last characteristic for a good interreligious dialogue. I would point to the ability to translate, and Asher, you already mentioned that as an important element in my own thinking, because every dialogue is about translating, saying the words of yourself in the words of the other human being and receiving his words in your own words, in your own worldview, which is not an easy thing to do. When we need a religious other, we necessarily translate. In dialogue, we listen to the other's narrative and allow her words to penetrate in our world. In dialogue, we translate our own world in the terms of the other and the other's world in our own words. This eminently dialogical act is possible since we live, my great argument, in one world. Engaging in interreligious encounters is a difficult task. The pitfalls or many. Jews and Muslims will have to respectfully listen to each other's narrative. This may be sometimes strange and surprising, yet we do not have to leave each other alone. Jews should not remain totally other to the Muslims, and the Muslims should not remain totally other to the Jews. We should listen to each other, meeting each other. Meeting the other always open new perspectives. Our religious others call upon us to be included in a shared common world. And therefore, I have a last wish that this forum for Jewish Muslim theology and thought, which had now the first inaugural conference, may flourish and blossom, and that we, in our dialogue, may blossom and flourish, and that we may discover a new horizon, ufuk, that leads us to more cooperation, coexistence, and happiness. Asher, Osher. Thank you.
I think, yeah. Thank you so much, Ephraim, for a beautiful lecture and the beautiful inauguration of our forum. You really articulated our hopes, but also our tasks for the forum. And you did something else. You recall at the beginning, on Monday morning, I said, we don't want a clumsy dialogue, because many of us are allergic to the term dialogue, mildly allergic, some more severely allergic, but we are very suspicious of the term dialogue. What you've shown us is that the word dialogue can be a very sophisticated concept, sophisticated task. There are many sides to it, and you've given it a degree of complexity that makes us rethink our allergies and maybe can work as an antidote to some of our allergies. To think of the human being as a peninsula certainly also introduces a meaningful image, and it does something else that characterizes your being in dialogue, and it's humor. And I think it comes back to the way you look at the world, at this one world, and the way you look at human relations. So thank you very, very much for this wonderful lecture. Ephraim has agreed to take some questions to continue our forum for our last act. And the floor is open to questions that you might have. I will walk around with the microphone. Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk. I had a question because, you speak so much about the importance of dialogue, the value, and defining it in these ways that Asher said, expand and make it so sophisticated. But you also talk about the limits of it, and with the example of, we don't dialogue with people who call for human sacrifice. At least in the United States, and I imagine here as well, I think around the world now, it seems that a lot of difference becomes cast in terms of that other people's views are violence or akin to human sacrifice, and it seems more and more that things like that example are getting in the way of dialogue. And so I just wanted to ask if you could reflect on, in a world where we are quick to identify the violence in opinions with which we disagree, how does one then get to the place that you're trying to get to?
Thank you so much, Shira, for this question. Yes, we live in a very violent world, and not so far from here. We know what is going on. With an expansionist and imperialist totally brutal war against Ukraine, and I was very much pleased to see that the Humboldt University has the Ukraine flag also. So we live in a violent world, and it's a little bit everywhere in the world. So we never will completely succeed to eliminate the violence in our worlds, but we can diminish it. And sometimes we have to do something violent in order to stop a greater violence. This movement is called defense. But the word defense is also problematic because it can hide it can contain a violent element. There are countries in which self-defense is a way of saying we do not tolerate these or other people. So the word defense can be problematic and must be problematized, and that's what I learned from the book on violence by Butler. She is writing an entire book on this problematization of defense. Nevertheless, defense can be a very important thing if violence is great. But here I would like also to ask you to reflect on the way of Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi was confronted with great violence, structural violence, legal violence, economic violence by the British. And he was in South Africa. There he started defending his people against this brutal structure of the British. And he continued to do so in India, and that's the way he became the Mahatma, the big soul, or the Bapu, the father of India. And he tried to convince the British that they could act differently by manifesting a non-violent protest. Now, this non-violent protest has given the British to think, what does it mean that if you kill 1, 2, 10, 100 Hindus that they do not react? Is this non-violent way not a kind of challenge for this violence of the British? And that's because he saw Brahman in every human being. So this is linked to the Gandhi's reverence for the human being, that Brahman is manifest in everything. If you take that seriously, then you have to see the creation as a self-multiplication of Brahman. Meaning, in his religious thought, he developed what he called the ahimsa. It's a Jain term, it's a Hindu term. Ahimsa is a non-violence. Now, it is not always possible to do that. And he if I may use the Israeli word fashla, he made also a great mistake by telling the Jews in the 30s of the preceding century that they do not have to resist Hitler. I think this is a very problematic statement. But I try also to reimagine Gandhi and to make him useful for today. Imagine that people who are in conflict march together, just as Martin Luther King and Avraham Joshua Heschel. Imagine that you can think about Exodus, which is a Jewish motive, and talk about the importance of the exodus of the black people in America. Black lives matter. And he did it. They did it. King was inspired by Gandhi. Could he do it in Israel and Palestine? So this is the way of thinking I try to also to convey, and I'm very conscious that the violence exists, and that sometimes, in order to protect your own family, you have to do something to the aggressor. But it doesn't represent an obstacle for developing a worldview in which you try to implement a kind of ahimsa, of non-violence, that could at least diminish the violence in this world.
Ephraim, thank you very much for an inspiring lecture. I learned a lot, and I am truly, truly touched by your words. I don't have a question. I have more of a comment, maybe, or an example for a non-violent revolution that is happening, has happened in the last over a decade, over 100 years, which is the feminist revolution. As another example for a non-violent resistance, enduring resistance that changes our world, changed our world, and still changes our world today. So I just wanted to add that to the wonderful examples that you gave.
Thank you, Yemima.
Thank you very much. The violence thing comes up, and as inspiring your presentation is, I now look about the reduction or containing the violence, discourse and practice in the debate on the Ukraine war. It's nearly also in the German discourse, it's reduced to think different, to contain, to reduce by a different way of talking. There was the Minister for Exterior from South Africa telling, Nelson Mandela, what did he do with de Klerk? Go to the enemy and talk. So it was a unique example that de Klerk and Nelson Mandela said so and thought so, with the concept of, at least with Nelson Mandela, of communicating, dialoguing, and going forward too, practically. And the same is true with Willy Brandt and Gorbachev. It was not Reagan that made the end of the Cold War, with all the miseries after that. It was a mix. Gorbachev looked to Willy Brandt, who said, okay, we have to come together. So in that sense, it's inspiring. And of course, I have these questions.
Yes, thank you very much for the question, because Ukraine is now the subject we have to talk about. So to make it quite clear, violence has to be stopped. So I think the Russian aggression is unacceptable. It's a kind of imperialism, a kind of dream of the Tsar, of that, that age. That has to be stopped. That's quite clear for me. Now, what I want to say is this. The non-violence about which I'm talking is far from naive. It implies also that you stop a great violence. And Mahatma Gandhi himself has given examples of the fact that non-violence implies also a certain violence. Because if you are protesting, and if you are saying that one has to defend himself, then you are not in the pacifist mode, you know. There is a difference between pacifism, absolute pacifism, and the non-violence a la Gandhi. That means that Gandhi, for instance, when there was a threat of the Japanese invading India, he said, no, we have to defend ourselves. And with the start of the war, the Second World War, he said that people have to defend themselves. He himself was in the British Army. He was somebody who was caring for wounded soldiers, etc. And he took care for the Zulus and for, you know, he was near Durban, and he took care of the people, but he was in the British Army. So I think sometimes we have to bring things together which apparently or paradoxically, at the first sight, they do not belong to each other, but they are belonging together. If you want a less violent society, sometimes you have to act violently.
Thank you. Are there any other questions maybe from this side? Because so far this side is winning. Okay, well, we've got one here. Good.
Dear Ephraim, thank you very much for your presentation. And you mentioned you spoke about the interreligious dialogue and the challenges that are included. And I couldn't help but think all the time, yes, there are many, many voices. There are many Jewish voices. There are many Muslim voices. But at the same time, we also should not forget that we have agency. We can choose which voice we want to listen to. And for me, your presentation, your speech was a voice of love for humanity, human wisdom, intellectual curiosity, but also a relatedness to God, coming out of a Jewish tradition. And I am very honored and pleased and happy that I can choose to listen to you. And you have directed many kind words toward me, but I believe that's actually something that the true addressees are the participants of this forum, who resemble these virtues that you have spoken about. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, Ufuk and I prepared a little song for you. We don't want to know exactly. We will have real music following this. But we want to take the opportunity to thank again our speaker, Ephraim Meir. We're really honored by your presence, not just tonight, but throughout the entire workshop. By thanking our participants, to our audiences tonight that you came to help us conclude this workshop, and to thank each other. Good. Now comes Michael Cohen-Weissert one more time with the musical number.
I decided to change the program a little bit because of this lecture, actually, and I don't know why, but it inspired me. So I'm going to actually play two songs. The first one is called Terminal by Meir Ariel. I don't know if that it's, well, I'm not going to recite it because it's long, but it speaks about a man who was prescribed to go to the airport to see the planes leave with there's a picture of a teared eye. That's a beautiful song to listen to. I would recommend anyway and read maybe a translation. And the second one is a song by Matti Kaspi called How I'll recite it because it's very simple. It goes like this. How is it that a single lonely star dares? How does he dare? For God's sake. A single lonely star? I wouldn't even dare, and I'm not even alone.
As the final act, please join us for a reception outside. Thank you.